You can be on a path and you can say it's a path that's set by sort of military regimentation and a sort of organizational theory teleology, or you can be on a path and it's a path that's set by fate and it's set by the supernatural and it's set by destiny. And Cassian seems to have trouble with both of these ideas. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political scientists who have just watched episodes 7, 8, and 9 of season 2 of Andor. And we're going to break down the main political ideas and themes that we see.
And this week, Stephen, we are joined by a special guest, Professor Rob Farley of the University of Kentucky, who is also the founder of the blog Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and a return guest to the pod. Welcome, Rob.
Thanks for having me back.
All right, great. One extra political scientist at no extra charge, and people say the economy's in trouble.
They just don't realize how good they have it.
Exactly. So, Andor 7, 8, and 9, the third arc in this series, I think we saw kind of 3 areas of political ideas and political moments and themes that we want to explore. We should, of course, say these are merely our interpretations. We've learned a lot in the previous episodes from the comment section and from viewers' own ideas of what's going on politically. We'd love to see some more of that. 3 political themes that I thought we would talk about. Theme 1, discipline, which I think literally, is literally talked about, especially in episode 7, as the discipline that's required of people as the rebellion moves from being a paramilitary organization to a military organization, but also kind of thematically or figuratively is referring to the discipline that's involved being on a path dependence, or if you prefer mysticism, having a fate, having a destiny, and particularly how that applies to Cassian, but also others. Theme 2, truth, who owns the truth, and rather crucially in this arc, who is sort of required to speak the truth.
And the relation of truth or objective reality to the logic of counter-subversion.
Absolutely. And then theme 3, the Ballad of Syril and Dedra. This is going to be a Rob section. The Ballad of Syril and Dedra is something that Rob wanted to talk about. And Rob also wanted to comment on actually a point we'd made in the previous podcast, which was to do with sort of the John le Carré spy thriller as being a sort of organizing intertextual reference, how that plays out in this arc. All right, should we get into it?
Let's go.
Okay, good. So theme 1, discipline, the discipline that is imposed on you or maybe is required to stay on a path towards a particular destiny, and also the discipline in the rebels becoming not a paramilitary but a military organization. Things are getting really organized around here is one of the first lines in episode 7.
Yeah, and we return to Yavin. Last time we saw Yavin, it was the kind of the comic farce of the first arc, in which you had the Maya Pei rebels who ended up getting eaten by the wilds, I suppose, literally. And now we're back, and things are starting to look a lot more like they are going to look a couple of years hence in Rogue One. And you're exactly right, Stephen. The first bit of dialogue that we get is the announcement of a new series of protocol for when people arrive at Yavin Base. They're going to check in immediately and they're going to follow protocol. And there is this kind of increasing discipline, as you say, increasing hierarchicalization of the entire operation. And this stands in pretty stark contrast to how we have seen the various splinter groups of the rebellion so far portrayed.
Yeah, and Cassian has trouble with this. Rob, do you want to speak to this a little bit? I mean, Cassian seems to be under the impression that he makes his own decisions, or this is something that he says again and again. I make my own decisions. He doesn't want to be sort of disciplined. Do you also see this kind of move from a paramilitary to a military organization going on?
Yeah. So there's a lot going on here. I think both sort of within the Star Wars universe, but also in terms of sort of the real world parallels and resonances, right? The consolidation of a military organization, of a terrorist organization, into a military organization is, it's a story that has been told so many times in the real world that you just sort of are looking at what parts are being picked from what sorts of historical examples. So, being how this episode ends, some of the resonances here, I feel like they are drawn directly from the Israeli-Palestinian experience, right? Which is in the 1940s on the Jewish side, where you do have this amalgamation in a very Yavin 4 way of different kinds of military capabilities, different groups of refugees who are working their way. And then you have very real conflict all the way up to the establishment of the State of Israel between these groups. I mean, they are actually fighting one another. And that you could say exactly the same thing about the consolidation of resistance in Gaza between the fights between Hamas and Islamic Jihad. You could make reference to the Chinese as well, right? So this is a story that is well told here, but that's been told lots of times in the real world, right? And it's almost inherently an interesting story. Here our person that we're talking about is Cassian, a person we don't see in this episode is Saw Gerrera, right? Who is an increasingly important figure, I think, in the Star Wars mythology, especially after the 4-5-6 arc sort of really brings him to the fore. The other group that we don't see here, but that we know exists because it dances all around them, is the Hera's group, right? Hera and Ezri Bridger's group, right? Who play a shadow role in episode 9, but who are in the background here and who are also sort of loosely affiliated with all of these rebel elements, but that are going to be drawn in as we push closer to BBY0.
Yeah. That's a good catch, Rob. I mean, the rebels world is starting to manifest, and we imagine we'll get more references to it or allusions to it, and maybe even the actual appearance of some of these folks in the next arc.
Again, sort of pushing forward to episode 9. I mean, one of the things we learn here is that there are actually 2 speeches that Mon Mothma gives, right? She gives one on the Senate, which is largely blocked, and then she gives another on Hera's flagship. And it's that we saw in the previous series. And that was a very deft way of smoothing over sort of canonical problems within the speechifying. But it also, suggests again this this multifaceted rebellion that hasn't quite brought itself together yet.
So the other thing that I think is going on is discipline, or being willing to follow. Military discipline is about being willing to follow an order of things and being willing to literally follow orders, and everything is kind of moving in a unified way towards a sort of strategic objective. I also thought thematically what was going on in the episode was that the chafing between these kind of ideas of being a loose cannon and having free will and making your own decisions, and actually being on a sort of teleology with a defined endpoint. And it seems to me that, Luthen, for example, is perfectly willing to accept and has come to accept that there is a teleology of this movement, and he's not a part of it going forward, right? His role is coming to an end. Cassian's having a harder time accepting that things are on a sort of train track towards a destination. And I think that's sort of underscored or emblematized in the tension that's going on with the force healers and the introduction of the kind of supernatural. Because you can be on a path and you can say it's a path that's set by sort of military regimentation and a sort of organizational theory teleology, or you can be on a path and it's a path that's set by fate and it's set by the supernatural and it's set by destiny. And Cassian seems to have trouble with both of these ideas. He has trouble with the idea that his path is going to be set for him by others as part of a military hierarchy. And he also has trouble with the kind of mysticism aspect of it, right? He doesn't buy the force healer stuff. He believes he makes his own decisions when he's told you have a destiny. He's not really into that. He says, what's special about me is luck. It's not anything more than that.
Yeah. And so it's super interesting. It's the first time we see any allusion over the course of almost 2 full seasons of Andor to the Force. And when we do see it, it's clear that while we know that there are Force sensitive people and Force capable people, we also start to learn that there are a bunch of charlatans out there. And that Marva's previous experience with one of these people is that they were charlatans. They were essentially snake oil salesmen. And this is the world that Cass has grown up in. And this is his kind of hard-boiled understanding of the circumstances in which he exists. And we know eventually he's going to continue to carry into Rogue One that kind of hard-boiled sense of his circumstances. But it's notable there that the Force and a Force-sensitive person does play a much more meaningful role in the narrative of Rogue One.
I loved the line, they would not try to be charlatans about it. They would not try to fake it if it never worked, right? Which is interesting because I honestly don't think that's true. In the real world, I'm not sure that's true, right? There are a lot of healing crystals out there. I don't think any of them actually work. But I think you guys are right. Like, Cassian is in fact the only figure in this series who, perhaps with the exception of Saw Gerrera, who we know his entire story. We know how this story ends. His end is written.
Yeah.
Right. In the most literal terms, his end is written. He has a very firm dynasty. And that's, of course, what makes the emotional hit of Bix's final speech to him come through all the while. So we don't know what happens to Bix. We know we sure as hell know that that Cassian Andor is not going to have a happy ending.
Yeah.
Right. He's not going to be on a beach with Bix in the end. Right. That's not how his tale ends.
Yeah, and I think you're right to take us to the very end of the arc and to
Mhm.
Bix's decision, because Bix believes in the Force healer and she believes in Cassian's specialness, not just as a romantic partner, but actually that he kind of has a destiny, he has a purpose, he has some place he needs to be. Cassian believes he's free to make his own decisions, and he believes he's made a decision that he chooses Bix over the rebellion. But discipline ultimately is enforced on Cassian, not by the kind of a semi-officious rebellion, flight controllers.
Yeah.
It's enforced by Bix, who makes the decision for him, right? The rebellion has been chosen for you over me. Cassian isn't going to make his own decision on that from that standpoint. And I thought it was quite notable in bringing together the two sides of this disciplinary object, right? The military object and the question of fate. That as soon as Bix says to him, or as soon as Bix has left him and has imposed that discipline on him to follow his fate, he's referred to as Captain Andor.
Yeah.
Right. So the military and the fate element both come together immediately, which is sort of thematically very satisfying, and goes to show again how sort of in control of its themes the writers of Andor are.
Yeah, and it also goes back to a theme that we talked about last week with contrasting styles of leadership within and without the rebellion. Here, we're getting the sense that Cass's form of leadership has to do with carrying the message. This is what the Force healer tells Bix. He is a messenger. And that, of course, will become literal in Rogue One. He will literally be the person who sends the message to the rebellion, identifying the fatal flaw in the Death Star. And so his vision of the vision of leadership, the kind of leader that Cass is becoming, is not one that he is, as you say, particularly interested in accepting, but it's one that people are telling Bix over and over again that he is now a leader. And this includes Vel, right, in episode 7. He says, you need to try to get through to him. You need to try to impose some discipline on him because he's a leader now. And so the storyline is wrapped up nicely at the end of episode 9 when Bix is the person who essentially makes the final move to turn Cass into a leader.
On these same lines, I was curious what you guys thought about the relative absence of Luthen Rael from this arc, right? He appears in episode 9, but not really all that. I mean, he appears consequentially in episode 9, but not for all that long. And how it plays with this aspect of discipline, right? Because however much Rael may understand himself to literally be on a rail to some kind of end, he does not understand himself to be part of the disciplinary hierarchical structure of the rebellion at all, right? Or at least at this point. And nobody else seems to regard him as part of that either, right? That he remains this kind of independent operator and coordinator rather than someone who can be ordered around by anybody.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it highlights for me what is the sort of overriding ambiguity in the relationship between what's happening on Yavin and the role that Luthen is playing. We know that Luthen's got some of his people there, but we also know that there are people at that base who are very much opposed to Luthen. He's not in charge of what's happening there. There's some kind of loose coordination taking place, but he definitely has been sort of in a theme you alluded to, Stephen. He's been sort of left behind by the increasing disciplinization, I suppose, or hierarchicalization of the rebellion.
Yeah, and I think it's deliberate that he's kept from this arc until the very end, and he says explicitly, "No Yavin for me." He knows that he's going to meet what I hope is a spectacular and honorable end in his current place on Coruscant. But I can't go to Yavin, right? I'm not suited for this new phase of the rebellion. I'm going to expend myself in this phase of the rebellion. And Luthen has been a very sort of consequentialist figure, or a figure who's okay with regarding others as means to an end rather than an end in and of himself. And he clearly regards himself as a means to an end. He's sort of totally happy with, maybe not happy, but totally accepting of his place in things. And Mon Mothma must go to Yavin, right? Because what the legit military organization needs is also a legit political
They
leadership.
need a public face.
Yeah, and she has to go in a very specific way and in a very sort of open way and a way with ceremony. But Luthen, that's not his business. That's not his thing. He's a spy in the shadows or a puppet master in the shadows. He's not a public figure.
Yeah, and speaking of, by the way, spectacular but perhaps not entirely honorable ends and someone being left behind, let's talk about Syril. Let's talk about Cyril's arc and his eventual demise. It doesn't end up well for Syril, but he seems to be another example of somebody who is kind of left behind by the change in circumstances of what's happening on a kind of meta contextual sense with these organizations.
Yeah, Rob, I know this was you wanted to talk about Syril a lot, so would you like to take this one?
Yeah.
Syril can be viewed as kind of, in Dungeons and Dragons terms, Syril can be viewed as kind of the ugly side of lawful neutral, right? That he does not understand, and he is not quite down with everything that the Empire is, right? And what the Empire is hidden from him, right? But what he seeks from the Empire and what he gets from the Empire is meaning, right? Is meaning and identity and a firm sense of himself and his role in the world, and a way to become a man of quality within this particular understanding of the world. And then, as he becomes, and as Dedra, sort of points out to him, we're becoming more and more important. Didn't you like the promotions, right? You were becoming more and more of an important figure, more important, more and more of a man of quality. That in the end, that's not enough, right? That his sense of identity is so fractured when he understands what's about to happen to Gorman, that the rest of the goodies aren't enough, right? He needed the discipline, he needed the sense of self-understanding, he needed to be on a path. And when he came to understand that the path that he was on was not the one he thought he was on, he had a complete mind fracture in a way that was completely believable for the character.
Yeah, and as per usual, the writers sort of nail it. I'm going to say something that sounds like an insult, but I mean as a compliment, by having characters enunciate the main themes of the of what's going on. But it's done so artfully that I never feel that it's cheap or just like Basil exposition has turned up to tell you what's happening. But Syril is asked twice versions of who are you? What kind of being are you? And then of course Cassian asks him right at the end, who are you? And he's stopped dead in his tracks by that question. I mean, literally stopped dead in his tracks. That's what allows him to be killed. And who he is, I think you're right, Rob, is someone who has been left behind and who can't quite accept the move from authoritarianism, which I think he's on board for, to not only totalitarianism, but a sort of totalitarian supernaturalism of the Empire going forward that's just monstrously and mystically sort of cruel. And that's not who Syril is. And he half kills two people because he's caught up in this bind of who am I really. He starts to strangle Dedra. He starts to kill her in the, maybe you want to save this for the third section, but I'll just put it on the table. He starts to strangle her starts to kill her in the most passionate way imaginable, which is strangulation. If you follow my line of thought there. And then he starts to kill Cassian. And he can't quite follow through on that either.
Also with his hands.
And he's sort of surprisingly good fighter, actually. But anyway, and he's caught betwixt and between. He's a figure who, like Luthen, has been left behind, but unlike Luthen, isn't at peace with it, hasn't reconciled himself to it or understood it properly.
An interview hit this morning with Kyle Solar, and he talked about that final fight, which is, and I think that requires more comment because he beats Cassian Andor down, right? And that's the most shocking part of the fight and the most fascinating part. And Solar worked through why that was. But evidently they shot 3 or 4 different lines. What was going to be Cassian's final line, and the one that stuck was the one where Solar sort of said, "Oh wait, who are you?" That is what would freeze me. right. This character, right? That is the line that makes sense at this very moment in terms of what I need this character to do, as opposed to like the other ones where Andor it did in fact recognize him at the end. But this "who are you," which is both an existential question for Syril at this particular moment and leveling the most dreadful insult towards like his entire life and his career, right? It's like, I don't even remember who you are, man. You're beating me down. I don't even know who you are.
That's exactly it. It's the exposition of Cyril's basic sense, or his basic insecurity about who he is, about why he exists in the world, and there's a way of seeing Cyril's entire arc from the beginning of season one that it's all about trying to find a place in the world and a set of relationships that feel like home to him. And so he's searching for these relationships or this sense of security everywhere. He's never finding it. And so, in sort of psychological terms, he just remains an immature and insecure figure over the entire course of his arc. And you're right, Rob. It makes Cassian's question, "Who are you?" like devastating. It's devastating in its revelation, but it sort of puts the cherry on top of Cyril's ill-fated journey through the Empire.
Yeah, that's it. Which of course, when we meet him, begins with his seemingly bizarre obsession with a minor crime in a backwater, and that these two have been bound together. They've been like two trains that are bound to collide at some point.
Yeah.
Sure.
He seeks his security first in his job as a corpo. Then it's in his relation. Well, at first it's his relationship with his mother, his fractured relationship with his mother. Then it's in his relationship as a corpo. Then it is, in the kind of the office space, bureaucratic hell of all of the
Bureau of
rust
Standards.
jobs, Bureau of Standards. Then it's in Dedra.
Yeah.
Then it's in Gorman, right? And remember from the last arc when he is praised by Partagaz as having done such a magnificent job of being a saboteur and infiltrating the fledgling Gorman resistance, he says, "This is the best day of my life." And it's played for comic effect, but it sort of contributes to this sense that he believes that he has finally found his place in the world and that his life has become a mature life of meaning and capacity. All the more cruel that it's all just a manipulation.
Right. Okay, I think we should take a quick break and then we should come back with the second of our big themes, which is truth. And we are back with our dissection of the political themes in Andor episodes 7, 8, and 9. The second major thematic sort of umbrella, I guess, that we wanted to talk about was this question of truth. It's something that many characters talk about, across these three episodes. There's a big set piece speech about truth. I thought, Jeff and Rob, while I was watching this, of Orwell's quote that in a time of deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. I'm sure that was something that was in the back of the minds of the writers. Nothing is more rebellious than insisting upon and clearly enunciating the truth when you're facing an enemy whose whole operations are clouded, as we've discussed previously on this podcast. Whole operations are clouded in a kind of not just a deceit, but a kind of flood the zone with type of approach to information operations. Where do you want to start with this?
So Mon Mothma's speech is all about this, and the death of truth is the ultimate victory of evil is kind of her big theme. And so I think we'll return to that. But interesting to call back to last arc about what you call the flooding the zone, or too much information, and the inability to distinguish between good information, bad information, too much and too little information, and that the capabilities of each actor seems to depend, or the overall skill level of each actor seems to depend upon their capabilities with sorting through too much information. And here, it feels to me like the Empire has moved in its strategy of narrative setting and of truth obfuscation. It feels like it has moved to a slightly different stage in the process of creeping authoritarianism on the road to totalitarianism. In the last arc, which takes place a year previous, of course, it very much is the flood the zone approach. It's throw everything out there, and as you referred to, everything is possible, but nothing is real, which is also a Living Color line from the song Type.
Nothing is true is the thing from the book, but I'll accept the amendment.
We'll say the Vernon Reed's vision is more accurate for my purposes. But what's happening here in this arc is that there is a very clear narrative now that the Empire has settled upon, and it is the kind of classic narrative of power and authority when confronted with resistance, when confronted with opposition. It's the classic, what we might call counter-subversive line about how power seeks to discredit challenges or even potential challenges to it. And so the line that we hear over and over and over again in this arc, and it's put first in the mouths of these kinds of pliant state journalists, then later in the mouths of some of the senators who are defending the creeping call of authority and of eventual totalitarianism. And they refer to the resistance in Gorman as the continuing and inexplicable resistance of Gormans to imperial norms. And so it's this line, continuing and inexplicable resistance, that suggests that opposition to power, opposition to the empire, even the potential of opposition to the empire, is not thinkable in ordinary normal terms. And so what's happening here is it's a narrative that seeks to cast out opposition and cast out the possibility of dissent from the normative universe, to make it something that is unthinkable, that is unreasonable, that is irrational, that lacks perhaps the sort of discipline that we were referring to in the previous section. And it strikes me as a slightly different kind of approach towards information than what we saw last week. It moves from this kind of flood the zone so nobody knows what's real to the kind of the second half of that, which is now that nobody knows what's real and what's true, we have much better seedbed to try to establish a narrative that would cast opposition and potential dissent as out of order, as out of the normative universe, as something that is simply unthinkable, unreasonable, irrational, and ought by rights to be quashed.
Yeah, Rob, how did you see this theme of kind of truth?
I find the idea fascinating. There are a few ideas about this that are bouncing around in my head. I mean, and a lot of them have to do with how Luthen thinks about truth, or whether Luthen thinks about truth at all, right? Whether truth is something that is important to him, right? And this reaches back to the previous arc, but you have to, right? Because it's all sort of the Gorman arc. Where, fundamentally in the end, Luthen doesn't really need to know what the Empire is going to do to Gorman, or even why the Empire is doing something to Gorman. And this is why he just fundamentally has such a disconnect with Cassian about how and why to support the rebels on Gorman, right? Which is like, look, it doesn't matter if they're any good at it, right? It doesn't matter if they're going to incur imperial retribution. That's ideal, right? Right. That's exactly what we're looking for, right? And so that places Luthen in sort of, this as having an odd perspective on truth, and generally speaking, not much of a need for truth, in the same way that someone like Mon Mothma has a need for truth. Or, even to take another figure from the rebellion, right, that we talked about before, like everything that Saw Gerrera does with himself is true, right? Right. It is powerfully and viscerally true as far as he is concerned, and he doesn't care about anybody else's concerns about that. And that also puts him at this distance from both Luthen and from Mon Mothma and the rest of the rebellion, and sort of makes him the oddball who's sort of sitting out there. But yeah, no, it's an awfully interesting theme about how the Empire is trying to construct this reality, and how different parts of the opposition to the Empire are dealing with the reality that the Empire is trying to build at this moment.
Well, it's such smart writing, because the evolving approach to what is the necessity of speaking the truth is paralleling the evolution of the rebellion and the Empire as kind of antagonist organizations. And what I mean by that is there was a lot made of Cassian's visit to Gorman earlier, where he discovers that the Gormans are trying to expose the truth of what the Empire is doing. And Cassian says this is a stupid plan. You're going to expose the truth of something everyone already knows. No one is going to care. This isn't going to achieve anything. Whereas in this episode, or in this act, sorry, the whole point is it's absolutely necessary to clearly and ambiguously and openly speak the truth, right? And that's because in a paramilitary context, or in the earlier context, for Cassian, exposing the truth is not. So what does it practically achieve? Yeah. Well, actually, once you move into a more organized and open concept, you absolutely need to be willing and able to identify a core truth and to say it out loud. And I did think Partagas had a good line here where he talks about how unlucky the Gormans had been. I mean, the Gormans have the approach to truth that that the rebellion's going to need going forward in its institutionalized kind of shadow government type of way, right? They're very honorable, and they want to expose what's happening and be upfront about it, and not really kind of, and not operate in the shadows or operate in a paratruth or in the half-light. They just got the timing wrong, and it was actually necessary for them to lose everything for things to progress to the point where you needed to enunciate the truth. And Partagas says, in relation to something else, in relation to the inability to find a sort of synthetic equivalent for calcite, so we need to actually destroy Gorman to get the calcite. Bad luck Gorman, right? That was unfortunate. But the Gormans were doubly unfortunate. They have that material unfortunate, outcome that there's no substitute for calcite. But they're also honorable people at the wrong point in a rebellion who have to be sacrificed in order for the thing to come into full bloom.
Right. And the thing about what we know of them as honorable is that that's the exact opposite of the imperial narrative about who they are and what's happening. And this is another sort of classic move that we have seen throughout at least modern history in the way in which power justifies atrocity. So we know, and it's almost unbearable in the tension that is built up, and it takes so long. We know this Gorman massacre is coming. We know what Mon Mothma is going to refer to as the Gorman genocide is on the way. We know it from the first episode of the season, and it builds and builds and builds. And even in episode 8, when we first see its initial foray, they build so much time and so much tension into those scenes, it feels almost unbearable. And when it finally arrives, it's brutal and horrifying. But all of this is set up in that kind of classic way of casting out the people who will be the victims of the genocide, casting them out of what I referred to earlier as the normative universe. These are unreasonable people. In fact, there's some question as to whether they're even people at all. Are they the kinds of people that we believe ourselves to be? And it's notable here that the Gormans are frequently referred to in sort of terms of, they're monstrous, they're unreasonable, they're savage, they behave in inhuman ways, in the ways that terrorists and other insurgents.
Awfully fond of those spiders. It's a bit weird, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the things that happens with Mon Mothma, right, and also with Wilman, this is a great point about Saw Gerrera. Remember, Wilman has become radicalized, not so much under Luthen, but under Saw Gerrera, who is someone who, Rob, as you say, very much believes in the truth, right? Speak the truth though the heavens may fall, so to speak. That both Wilman and Mon are very, very careful and intentional about referring to their imperial opponents as monsters. They are the monsters. They are the monsters, right? And it's an attempt to recast the victims of power within the normative universe as people like us. Different, perhaps, but effectively like us, not different than us. And so therefore, demanding of a certain kind of humane and, I suppose, reasonable treatment.
One bit of this is that's interesting to me, to sort of to drift back to Luthen, and I think that this may project to the third thing that we're going to talk about. So at the risk of pushing into that a little bit, unlike Cassian, right? Unlike the good citizens of Gorman, unlike Syril, Partagons and Dedra and Luthen all want this to happen. Right. They all want the Gorman massacre to happen. Right. And they are all working together assiduously to make it happen. Right. That Luthen, Dedra is setting this up as a thing that is going to happen. Partagons is fully in supportive of her setting this up in a way that's happened, and Luthen is happy to abet the imperial actions and to push it in the direction that they want to push it, right? Of this sort of cycle of retribution. And so I'm not sure how closely that mirrors or how that interacts with this question of truth, with this theme of truth, other than again to say that, for parts of the rebellion, right, the worst that could happen for Luthen would be that the truth comes out, right? That the truth comes out and someone stops the Emperor from strip mining Gorman, right? That would indicate that the system is working. And that's the last thing that Luthen wants, right? So the truth is actually dangerous to him. I mean, he may or may not. I don't think it's ever made clear if he knows what's going to happen to Gorman after the massacre. But if that were to be stopped by the action of the Senate, that would be catastrophic, for Luthen and for Luthen's progress, right? And so, for him, the actual truth of what's going on is secondary or even really antithetical to the political aims that he's trying to achieve here.
Maybe just to tie this theme of truth, to tie a nod in it, and of course it's throughout the episodes. There's Mon Mothma's speech, there's Palmo on radio, this is murder. If you believe in truth, pass this message on. There's Bail Organa says to Mon Mothma, the winner writes the story, and Mon says they haven't won yet. So this really is all over this. I thought there were two areas where our two themes sort of collided: this question of truth and this question of discipline, or being on a teleological path towards a destiny. I thought one was in Luthen's exchange with Cassian, where Cassian's saying, you can come to Yavin, and Luthen's saying no, and you have to understand your destiny, Cassian. And Luthen says to Cassian, they'll hang us both, right? You have to understand this is where it's going. You see no truth in that, is the question that he asks, which is a really odd way to say, don't you think that's accurate, that they're going to, so clearly the writers are really trying to bring these themes together. And then Luthen says some further interesting things that get to this question of, how much of a railroad is Cassian on. He says, we set the course to us both being hanged effectively by the Empire the first time that we met. Everything that's happened has been sort of inevitable from that first interaction that we had. And then he says an interesting thing: you appeared when I needed you, which kind of gets this question of, is there a mystical greater design going on? So I kind of thought truth and sort of destiny were kind of tied up in that.
And that's really interesting, though, for Luthen to have said that, and for you to have noted that, Stephen, because recall back in season 1, Luthen already knows who Cassian is before he meets him for the first time. So has he really appeared when he needed him, or has Luthen spoke Cass's existence?
Well, that's the double-sided thing. And then this has been written into Cassian's story since Rogue One, and since Donnie Yen's character, where, as far as I could understand it, it's never made clear whether he's just really good with his senses because he's blind, or whether he's actually force sensitive, and that's why he's able to dodge all the blasters. I'm sure there's some law resolution out there, but that's as presented on screen. There's that ambiguity between the kind of choices he's making for himself and some sort of supernatural destiny. The other sort of collision of the themes that I saw was the story of Mon's escape, or the story of Mon's arrival on Yavin 4. And we've just spent a long time going on about Mon Mothma as truth teller, right? And how important it is that she's now the key political figure, and the rebellion must be seen to be telling the truth, telling the Gorman story, telling the truth of Palpatine is a monster. He's not who you think he is. And yet, they retcon how she gets to Yavin 4 for public consumption, right? It cannot be Cassian who sneaks her out in the middle of the night. She has to arrive with an escort and with ceremony, and there's it has to be an arrival that's fit for an official leader who's going to be an open and public figure who has to be seen to be truthful, and yet that very backstory is untruthful.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it illustrates again the contrast between a legitimate rebel army and a kind of paramilitary organization in which the leaders sort of appear from out of nowhere. They're frequently like, I'm thinking of, various South American rebel leaders where they're frequently covering their face. You can't really see them, or they have
nom de guerre.
Yeah, right. And this is the exact opposite of that. We know, people already know who Mon Mothma is, but now she must be seen as the kind of regal, capable, legitimate figure that an army or a rebellion that seeks legitimacy needs.
Yeah, and that's been the path she's been on for the whole, for the whole series, really. Yeah. All right, guys. Anything else? I think we want to move to kind of the third and final segment here, and really turn things over to Rob. Is there anything else you guys want to say on truth, or on this collision of the two themes, or do you think we got that?
No, I'm good.
Okay, and so we will be right back with the third and final section of our wrap-up of episodes 7, 8, and 9 of Season 2 of Andor. And we are back with our wrap-up of episodes 7, 8, and 9 of Season 2 of Andor, and we wanted to turn things over to our guest here, Rob Farley, who has a number of things to say about Syril, Dedra, Le Carre, and all sorts of other stuff. Rob, take it away.
It is, of course, unusual for a Star Wars property to successfully display romantic relationships, right? And I'm not sure that what we have seen through these 2 years is the display of a successful romantic relationship, but it is certainly a successful display of some kind of romantic relationship. It has captured my attention. It's captured a lot of people's attention. This is Syril and Dedra, and I've listened to some of the things you guys have done before, and I mean it's just very different. I have sort of looked at this and said, could you outtake this relationship? Because they're not actually on screen for that long across the entire series, right? But from their initial meetings in season 1 to the Gorman arc, the 4, 5, 6 arc, in where the sexual relationship is hinted at, to Dedra's conversation with Cyril's mother in the first arc, which is just so beautiful, right? That I think it almost does it a disservice to say that this is just a fascinating picture of a relationship between two people who are in a continuous process of being broken, right? Who are in a continuous process of falling apart, and how it is brought to such an unexpected head at the end, right? Because my assumption had always been that Dedra was at some point simply going to discard Syril, right? That was how this was going to end. That it was going to be Syril, who would sort of his utility would reach an end, and that she would move on. And that's exactly what didn't happen, right? That he becomes enraged with her. He and it builds to, once again, the complexity and the fascination of Cyril's character, right? That he is about to execute this horrific act of domestic violence against his partner, right? But at the same time, the viewer is sitting there, oh yeah, she is a genocidal maniac, so maybe it's okay. I don't know, right? How are you supposed to deal with this, right? But that after he tries to choke her out, she's unbothered by it, right? It's not
Yeah.
problematic, and that is completely believable, right? That this incredibly powerful figure who could have Syril erased from the universe with the snap of her fingers, like the act of violence against her just makes her more desperate for him, right? And just on a personal level, this sort of appalling degree of loneliness that is basically her existence and his existence in some way, that they really do complete one another in a relationship that works for both of them for a while, right? And it's a degree of complexity in a romantic relationship, and I'll get in a second, but I'm curious what you guys, just sort of on that part of it, what you guys have to say, but there is a connection to Le Carré coming up, but just how successfully that they are able to put together this relationship between these two deeply flawed, deeply damaged people in an incredibly compelling way that has exactly the answer that you want it
Yeah,
to have, the answer you didn't even know you needed.
it's a really interesting take. The relationship, you are correct, I think, Rob, is fascinating and in some ways overwhelming, maybe precisely because we see so little of it. We talked last week about the degree to which Dedra's interior life is covered and, you know, sort of protected from view, from viewers, from the people around her, clearly from Syril as well. But it struck me this week that there's a certain kind of opacity in Cyril's interior life as well. We can intuit a lot of things and we can imagine a lot of things about the dysfunction and the kind of the brokenness, Rob, that you refer to about Syril. But there's still a lot that's under the surface and under the surface pretty deeply. And so it makes you wonder, I mean, what does it look like when two people who are completely withdrawn are interacting with each other? It probably is exactly like the sorts of rare scenes that we see between Syril and Dedra.
Obviously, there's great poignancy in
Yeah.
in this the end of Cyril's arc, and in some sense, it's sort of strangely redemptive, isn't it? That he never quite he can't go through with the genocidal, he can't go along with the genocidal thing, and he never kills the
Yeah.
two people that he has the chance to. And the other element of this that I think will stay with me for a while from these episodes is the reaction of the two women in Syril's life to news of his death. You know,
Yeah.
if he was truly a sort of worthless, but one measure of your worth perhaps is how do people, and you never quite know this, but what are people going to say at my funeral? How are they going to react to my death? And Dedra's reaction is, you know, she sort of pulls at her uniform, right? And she's sort of chafing against this thing that she's become and trying to pull it straight and trying to find a way to fit in the uniform after the loss of Syril. So she obviously, it wasn't just for her. She obviously had real feelings. And then the other thing I thought was really poignant was seeing his mother, for once not say a word, thank goodness, but seeing her just silently with her friends watching the news and just shedding it, and at the end, for all she's disparaged Syril, he's still his son.
Right.
And she still loves him, and she never quite was able to show it in a way that was helpful or useful, but to Syril.
Yeah.
But I just thought that was very poignant. That was handled in absolutely the right way.
So to connect this, and I know you guys, again, you've discussed Le Carré, and the first two arcs, especially 4 through 6, just seem to me to be borrowed straight from classic John Le Carré. What a lot of people miss about Le Carré's finest novels is how they are built upon characters who are deeply flawed, who have deeply flawed and complex emotional relationships to other characters, right? So in Tinker Tailor, right, Carla is able to take advantage of Smiley because Smiley has a philandering wife, right? And this leads to the affair that is at the core, which creates this blind spot for Smiley so that he can't see who the mole is, right? At the end of the Carla trilogy, Smiley turns it around by taking Carla's like single human weakness, which is for his daughter, and flipping that on him, right? And that is true of most of the other characters in sort of the ancillary ones as well, right? Including even as far back as the spy who comes in from the cold and so forth, right? Where the flaws and problems and deeply complicated personal relationships of these figures become part of the spy story, right? They become essentially the catalysts that drive the sort of overarching big spy story forward. And, what Gilroy has accomplished here, right? That, and I think that this is probably a point that can be belabored a little bit, right? The creating of real and deep and human feeling characters in this show allows the show to step forward and to move into this Le Carré territory, right? Where you can start telling complicated stories about the functioning of these organizations that are predicated upon believable human relationships. And one of the moments where it came through for me in the last arc was when the Gorman rebels are essentially, they track down Syril's background, and they say, oh, well, he was a disgraced officer here. And so that is a straight Le Carré move, right? That is like, and that is Dedra, and that Dedra has set it up that way, and Partagon's has set it up that way to make sure that Syril's, I don't even know if Syril knows, but they have made sure to make Syril's background known and aware to the Gorman resistance, so that the Gorman resistance will find him more believable, right? And so, I guess another way of saying this is that the good character work here is not just window dressing. It's not just incidental, right? It is the core to the moving forward of plot elements, right? The creation of these believable characters who react in believable ways that then have sort of unpredictable expectations down the road.
Yeah, and it just points to in many ways, the overarching theme of this universe, the Andor Rogue One universe, and the sort of modus operandi of the entire thing, the master narrative. These are stories about people, and usually about ordinary people, not people who are necessarily heroes or leaders in any way. We do get some of that, I think, more so this season than we did last year. But this is the story, or a series of interconnected stories, about how ordinary people interact with one another under circumstances of extreme power and extreme powerlessness. And that is both really engaging and really interesting, but it is really unusual in the Star Wars universe. And I suspect that is at the core both of the show's appeal and, the show's lack of appeal for some segment of the Star Wars audience that is really invested in a different kind of storytelling.
Yeah, the sort of geometry we tried to draw on this in a previous episode, Rob, was Andor is to the Star Wars of the movies as Le Carre is to James Bond, and of course Le Carre was a was a reaction against Bond, and Le Carre said that's all nonsense. It's much more ordinary and squalid than that, and they're not superheroes. And I think that's what Gilroy's saying about this universe. And I thought you made a really excellent point, Rob, when we were kind of planning the episode, where you said that in some sense Andor's doing something Le Carre never did, which is to talk about not just the spies and the game as ordinary people, but actually talk about the broader impact of these games that are being played, which is a Le Carre, I don't know, blind spot, or it's something he doesn't really want to do. But Andor has really brought home, I think, in a visceral way, that the wider stakes of these games that are played.
There is this Smiley Carla game being played between sort of Dedra Paragons on the one side and Luthen Rael and Andor on the other side, right? And one of the fascinating things is that to this point, right, we still don't know who has won that game, right? Because both sides are attempting to lead the other, but they're leading the other to the same place, right? That both Rael and Dedra, they want this massacre in the end to happen. They need this massacre in the end to happen. And from time to time, I'm sitting there thinking, right, who is winning this game, right? Is Luthen being trapped? Like, in some sense, he is being trapped, because he doesn't understand when he is committing more resources to Gorman. He doesn't understand where the Imperials are going with this, right? So is the ISB really sort of being able to trap Luthen here, or are they falling into his broader trap, right? And all of that is very straightforwardly, that is very classic Le Carre, right? You never know whether Smiley or Carla is the one who's trapping the other. But then with the massacre, all that breaks into the open, right? And so all of those games become just manifest in this horrific set of moments where people are being gunned down right and left and all. And yeah, I mean, that is something that does escape the way that the spy game is being framed earlier in the arc.
And I did think on that point that part of Dedra's emotionality, which is, I think you're right, is mostly linked to Syril's death. Part of it also appears to be she is seeing all of this with her eyes, and there's a way in which maybe for Dedra it feels like it's not a game anymore, right? All of the game-like elements, the behind-the-scenes strategy stuff that's really interesting and exciting and fun and engaging, has now become literal. And in so doing, Dedra is being presented with the truth of the thing in front of her eyes. And it does seem like as this arc goes on, that kind of dawning realization, which is maybe also complemented by the realization that Dedra is starting to have, that she is also being manipulated here. She's not simply the game master, right? That Partagaz is also manipulating her in a desire or in a goal to get the ISB in good with the Emperor and to curry the Emperor's favor. Now, of course, what we know, eventually the ISB is going to have the most massive of possible failures, right? It is going to not prevent the leaking of the Death Star flaw. And it's at that point, of course, I mean, who does the Emperor turn to run intelligence at that point? Darth Vader. So there are all these nested games, so to speak, taking place. But all of the characters are simultaneously, they're trying to play the game, but they're also being manipulated as well. And there is this kind of degree to which it spills out into real life in ways that I'm not sure that all of the participants quite are prepared for.
Yeah. Okay, so a final section, Rob, we usually do is sort of nitpicking, picking nits. Sometimes this is actual problems on the show. Much more often it's things usually I have failed to understand or totally missed. So I'm going to put a couple on the table, one big and one small, and I don't know if you guys either want to respond to those or bring up your own. The small nitpick I had is Cassian's cover is as a journalist, and he uses that twice, which is bad spycraft, by the way, to use the exact same cover twice, once on Gorman and once in the Senate. But that's sort of explicable because the hotel guy says, I never logged you in. So, all right, that work name is still kind of usable, I guess, or that cover is still usable. But why, when he's going around the Senate, does no one notice that someone's just beat the out of him? Like, what happened to you, journalists? Why do you have like a fat lip and a black eye? And he's all beaten up, and it must be rough on the mid-rim news network or whatever it is. Anyway, that's a minor nitpick. Maybe a more serious one for me is I continue to be a bit troubled by Bix's arc, from the standpoint of some of the ways that attractive female characters are used in stories, with when they surround male protagonists. Last week, I was a bit troubled that, we'd seen a couple of major things happen to Bix. One was she was tortured, and there's a sort of voyeuristic, sometimes, element to that portrayed on screen. And then she kind of reaches some sort of resolution, but it's heavily mediated by others. And then the other thing that's happened to her in this season is she's sort of leered at and nearly raped. And again, achieves some sort of resolution, but also mediated by others. And I thought, is this a great story of agency and self-directed action, or is she rather someone who's most often acted upon in distasteful ways? And then this week, her decisions are absolutely crucial to the main themes of the story and the arc. But her major role in the narrative is to make a decision on Cassian's behalf that precludes him from domesticity and pushes him, into being the public man of action. So she is not the public figure, right? She is the person who must be the woman behind the man who acts to make his more important historical role crucial and possible. Now, this is an unfinished arc, maybe, so I'm sure we'll hear of her in the final 3 episodes. I'm aware that's a kind of partial reading, but it did set off a few kind of warning bells. Did you guys react the same way? Am I way off base here? I mean, what do you guys think of that?
Well, I would say, so to your first nit about the role of Cass as a journalist and how freely he moves around the Senate, in spite of what we have been told and what we see on screen is heightened security protocol. To me, I wasn't bothered by this. I actually thought it was quite clever writing, because it indicates just how much journalism as part of the civil society of the empire has been decimated and made non-threatening, right? Which links back to our theme about truth telling, right? And the capacity to understand and to have an objective reality. Journalists are portrayed throughout really the entire season as inconsequential minor figures, as people to not be threatened by, not to take seriously. Their capacity to shine a light, right, on corruption, for example, or to shine a light on power, has been so neutered that they are simply not seen as a threat anymore. So sure, let's let a journalist, who cares? They're just going to go, they're like society figures. They're just going to go out and cover the red carpet. And so why bother to do any kind of security protocol on Cassian Andor? He's just a useless journalist.
So I can buy that conceptually, but here's the actual thing we're showing on screen, right? Which is a security, not guard, but the guy who's checking people in, finds that Cassian's journalist is unregistered, says, "Why are you not in my logbook?" Looks right at him for about 5 minutes and fails to say, "Oh, by the way, why is your lip split? Why do you have a black eye?" Why? Like, that's the bit that kind of threw me out a little bit. Wouldn't it be a point of, you all right, buddy? I mean, what?
So if you imagine them as such an inconsequential figure, are you even looking at them? Are you even clocking any of the details that you're saying? Rob, do you have a sense of?
I have thoughts, right? So one, I would say that however much I love this arc, and this is my favorite arc so far of season 2, it struggles the most with the 3-day structure, right? It's like, this is a lot of stuff to happen in 3 days, right? And we know from the aftermath of October 7th, right, that it takes a lot longer than 3 days to figure out what just happened after a horrific thing like this, right? And so I struggled with like, I know that information flight, although even does it, right? Because the Star Wars universe is sort of weirdly analog, right? Where people flip switches and so forth rather than press buttons. But so I did think that they struggled to put everything into the 3-day. with respect to the journalist question, the scoundrels of the Star Wars universe are not journalists; they are smugglers, right? But you could probably go back and you could rewrite the entire saga, making Han Solo and Lando Calrissian journalists instead of smugglers, and in some ways it would work just as well. Right, that Jabba would be hunting down Han for a bad story in the Tatooine Times or something like that, and so and I think it would work. It would work perfectly. It also occurred to me that that Cassian looked a lot healthier than he should have.
Yeah.
Um, but in the same way that in Star Wars we don't see people going to the bathroom, we also don't see them taking stim packs, right? So if you've ever played a Star Wars game, you know that your character Cal Kestis or whomever has a bunch of stim packs that you just take whenever you're injured, and they regenerate you. And so my assumption is that he had stim packs on the ship, and that's why he was in a relatively put together when he finally arrives. One question, and I won't call it a nit, right? But it was interesting, and I would have to watch this over again to make sure that I'm right about this. Bix did not mention to Cassian that she knew Dedra Meero, right? I mean, she had the opportunity to, and she
I did
didn't.
watch this, Rob. I watched the episode again this morning before we shot, and while Cass is watching Bix very closely while she's looking at the pad with Dedra's face on it, and so I think it's communicated. I think we're supposed to understand that Cass knows who Dedra is in relation to Bix.
That's interesting, right? Because my assumption had been that Bix would have assumed that Cass would not be careful if he knew who Dedra Meero actually was and what she had done to Bix in those previous episodes in terms of facilitating the torture. But I had not had the opportunity to watch it again. It had seemed like there was some recognition, but maybe not all of the information about who she was being passed between the two of them.
Yeah, and on the larger theme of sort of Bix's arc, those are trenchant observations. I don't know if we're going to see more of Bix. So you sort of get the sense at the end of episode 9 that this is the end of Bix's story. I don't know if she'll be back in the final arc, as Rob alluded to already. If it's truly the last that we see of Bix, she leaves on a very heartbreaking note, because we know that she will not meet up again with Cass. This is the end of their time together. But I think that's a meaningful. I'm not even sure it's a nit. I think it's a significant insight about the nature of how Bix's arc has been constructed and about the nature of how she's being portrayed. And I hope that we see more of her in the final arc, and that maybe the story isn't complete. But if it is, I think those are meaningful concerns.
All right, chaps. So thank you, Rob, for being this week 33% of the
50%.
No, 33% of the poli-sci professor's presence, an additional 50% over the usual duopoly. But here's the thing. He's made us 82% more intelligent in our analysis of Andor, and that's just science of any variety and facts.
Objective reality.
Objective reality. It's truth. It's truth, and we've been disciplined in presenting it. So thank you very much, Rob. It's been an absolute blast. Thank you as always, Jeff.
Yeah.
We'll be back next week with our analysis of the final 3 episodes of Andor. But for now, on that bombshell,